So delighted to see him here again. Tony is a psychiatrist and he holds the Health Foundation Chair in Learning Disability at the University of Cambridge. He established the Cambridge Intellectual and Developmental Research Group. His specific interests include the eating, behavioural, mental health problems associated with PWS, the relationships between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease, and also clinical legal needs relevant to the needs of people with intellectual disability. He has always been available for us at PWSAI for conferences and is now the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for IPSO. Today, Tony will talk about new interventions in PWS and how they are developed. Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Again, it's a pleasure to be here, and Don and Marguerite, thank you very much for asking me to be part of this meeting and for your hospitality over the last 2 days. It's, as always in the Republic, been just fantastic. Thank you. My talk is a bit different because what I want to try and do is paint for you a picture about how one engages in research to answer some of the questions, some of the issues that have been raised and discussed today. So how do you involve people with Prader-Willi syndrome, families and others in order to answer these questions? So what I want to do is to, in a sense, describe the research process to you. And as a psychiatrist, my examples will tend to focus around behavioural and psychiatric issues. But I'm going to talk about it, if you like, warts and all. I want to show you that research is sometimes a rather muddled and confusing experience. Sometimes you get conflicting findings and so on. But out of the process of research, answers emerge which bring benefit to people with Prader-Willi syndrome. So that's the sort of message that I'd like to give. So what I want to do is to really illustrate how out there in many countries in the world, there's a wide spectrum of basic clinical and social science research and applied research, which somehow tries to build and develop a often confusing and contradictory picture out of which these new ideas and interventions emerge. I want to try and illustrate how, at its most logical, and often it isn't very logical, research progresses from identifying the problem to defining and measuring it, to investigating the cause, and here I'm talking about mechanisms, and to developing an understanding, and then applying the findings to developing new interventions. But I also want to make the point that particularly in an area such as Prader-Willi syndrome, where you're talking about complex genetics that Junan has discussed with us, but you're also talking about complex issues relating to the brain, it's really new technologies that are allowing us to address questions that 10, 15 years ago just would not have been possible. And that's the exciting thing. And for me, part of, if you like, the way I think about this is that people with Prader-Willi syndrome have as much right as anyone else to the use of these technologies to address the complex issues that affect them. Now, I want to start by just painting a picture of some of the research that goes on, which generally will then be discussing in more detail. But one of my tasks as chair of the Scientific Advisory Board of IPSO is every few months to assemble the papers that have been published in those months and then send them out through the IPSO network so that clinicians, parents, others can look at those papers and get some idea of the type of research that is going on. And in the last 3 months or so, these are examples of some of the papers that have been published in scientific journals. So there have been 5 papers on behavior and quality of life, a paper, for example, on skin picking. One of the perhaps most interesting ones has been an Australian study on the trial of the use of intranasal oxytocin to see if that improves social functioning and behavior. Sadly, after observations in France that have suggested it might be helpful, this Australian study has suggested that really it doesn't bring any benefit. There's also been a paper published looking at the relationship between autism and Prader-Willi syndrome, again confirming that people with the UPD form of Prader-Willi syndrome tend to have more autistic characteristics in their development than those with Prader-Willi syndrome due to a deletion. There's been 8 genetics papers in these months, and you've heard about the genetics already. And one of the gene that has most excited people at the moment goes by the term SNORD116. So there's papers on that, papers about prenatal testing, and also a paper about mitochondrial genes. And the mitochondria is the energy source in the cell, and there are genes there as well that are inherited down the maternal line. And that's caused interest because there are things about Prader-Willi syndrome that suggest that there may be a mitochondrial dysfunction. As one might expect, there have been papers on endocrinology and growth hormone, as well as on hormones such as ghrelin, which is a hormone released into the blood and stimulates eating behavior and caused a lot of excitement some years ago in Prader-Willi syndrome, although that to some extent has died down now. And as I say, there have been further papers on growth hormone use. In terms of obesity and eating behavior, just one paper looking at a mouse model. So these are ways that geneticists create the same genetic defect as you get in Prader-Willi syndrome, in this case in a mouse, and then for obvious reasons you can look at that in much more detail than you can in humans. And there are a range of papers on gait, sleep, lifestyle. There's a cohort study from France describing experiences of a whole group of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, paper on gut function and constipation, and paper on epilepsy. So I hope that sort of gives you an idea that within research across the world, there are people from very different backgrounds and expertise applying their understanding, their expertise, to trying to make sense of some of the particular problems that are so characteristic to you, whether it's about behavior, whether it's about genetics, whether it's about the gut, whatever it's about. There is research going on, and the amount of research that's going on, I think, is considerably more than it was in the past, and that can only be a good thing. Now, in thinking about this talk, I sort of reflected on what are the ways that research up till now has contributed to our understanding of Prader-Willi syndrome in a way that brings benefit to people with Prader-Willi syndrome and their families. And I think actually strikingly, one of the things that is really now very clear is that Prader-Willi syndrome is a syndrome that evolves over time. And the phenotype being the physical and behavioral characteristics of a particular genetic syndrome, the phenotype evolves. So in utero, the mother may notice poor fetal movements. There's a high rate of atypical birth. We're all aware of this hypertonia and failure to thrive. And then colleagues in the States have looked at the particular stages in this early failure to thrive phase of Prader-Willi syndrome. We're aware of the developmental delay and the appearance of intellectual disabilities, the short stature and sexual immaturity, the risks of overeating that emerge from this early phase of failure to thrive, the scoliosis, respiratory problems, and maladaptive behaviors. We're also focusing more and more on the needs of adults with Prader-Willi syndrome, with the increase of obesity that may come with the increasing independence in adult life, but also with age-related physical and psychiatric, what's called comorbidities, so the emergence perhaps of mental health problems, mental illness, or the emergence of diabetes, particularly in the advent of obesity becoming a bigger problem. I think this pattern of change over a lifespan is really quite remarkable, the way we now understand that. So parents of newborn children with Prader-Willi syndrome will have a sense of some of the problems and challenges and how one might prevent and deal with them as they arise. Of course, all children and adults with Prader-Willi syndrome are different, but what we can be clear about is there are certain core features that emerge from during pregnancy, at birth, and into later life. You've heard about the genetics. The point I want to make from this slide is that really the genetics were fully elucidated in the early 1990s with the final description of the disomy. Before that, the deletion had been described. The challenge in genetics now, which I think interestingly still has not been answered despite many, many years of genetic research, is to try and understand, just get the right one for, despite many years of genetic research, is to try and answer what are the gene or the genes that are not being expressed in the way that Junan described that result then in Prader-Willi syndrome. Now I want to imagine this is a scheme of a tiny, tiny bit of DNA that between the breakpoints that Junan talked about. And here's the gene that people talk about a lot called SNORD 116. And one of the questions has been, is that gene, the absence of expression of that gene, sufficient to cause the Prader-Willi phenotype, or do you have to lose the expression of a number of genes in order to get the full phenotype? And the way that people have tried to answer that is they've looked at examples of a number of people who've been born with syndrome very like, if not identical to Prader-Willi syndrome, who've been found to have rather unusual deletions. And what you can see is that these deletions all span a common point, which includes SNORD 116. The other area, and this is not such a nice diagram as was shown earlier, but the other area of interest, of course, has been around the hypothalamus and the importance of the hypothalamus in terms of growth and sex hormone production, and control of eating behavior, temperature regulation, and so on. So what I want to do now is just to reflect on what difference I think research might have made. What is perhaps the most striking features? Well, I think, first of all, that Prader-Willi syndrome has this phenotype, so the physical and behavioral characteristics that evolves from in utero throughout life. I think that understanding and the recognition that there is certain behavioral and cognitive and physical characteristics that are very common and central to Prader-Willi syndrome and how they evolve over time has been very important. The second thing, of course, has been the genetics. Now, why is that particularly important? Because the genetics itself hasn't led, if you like, to any new treatments. What it's led to is early diagnosis. So for those of you who have a young baby with Prader-Willi syndrome or a child with Prader-Willi syndrome, I think your life is different than those of you who have an adult with Prader-Willi syndrome who is now in their 20s, 30s or 40s, in which when that child was born, the genetics may not have been fully worked out, the diagnosis may not have been made some years into the child's life. So it is now possible to start interventions and to advise about interventions very early in life. Most importantly, the need for food security to prevent obesity with this transition, growth and sex hormone replacement, behavioral management and the treatment of physical and psychiatric comorbidities, illnesses as they emerge. And of course, what it's done through the work of associations such as this one is really raise the whole question about the importance of specialist, what I've called Prader-Willi syndrome-informed social support. Now, I want to now move to my area, and I want to take you through how I think we're trying to look at some of the behavioral and psychiatric aspects to illustrate to you the process of research, and to try and argue that that process of research is very much a partnership. It's a partnership between yourselves and people who engage in research, particularly with people with Prader-Willi syndrome, who are willing and able to take part in research. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. But what is it that as someone who, both as a clinician, as someone who engages in research, what do I think in my field are some of the important issues? Well, for me, I think the fundamental question is, what are some of the mechanisms, what are some of the causes of the evolving behavioral phenotype that I'll come back to in a moment, and how does that link to the genotype? At the moment, we don't properly know exactly what genes are involved, but we certainly don't know how the absence of expression of those genes affects the brain and in turn gives rise to this high risk of certain behaviors. So then the next question is, how do we best understand, prevent, and treat these aspects of the behavioral phenotype of Prader-Willi syndrome? And one very key question for me is, why does the psychotic illness that has been described predominantly affect those with UPD? Now, I mention this for one particular reason that I want to really reinforce, is that psychotic illness actually is a very treatable illness. The failure in the past has been to recognize it when it occurs. And now I think one of the advances I like to think in my field of psychiatry is people are aware of this risk. They pick it up when it occurs, and it's not inevitable, but the risk is quite high. They pick it up when it occurs, and there are effective treatments. And I was at the UK Prader-Willi Syndrome Association meeting this weekend, and in a workshop we had, a mother described very nicely how the psychosis was recognized in her, now I think he was 17 at the time, child with Prader-Willi syndrome, and that the use of the right medication returned her child to her, how effective it was. It's not always one hears that in psychiatry, and it's really rather nice to hear, which is why I feel I must tell you. I think the real challenge, of course, is then how to translate what we know into good practice. And that's a real challenge. And I think, as it really has come up in discussions today, that is a very important role for organizations such as, well, national Prader-Willi syndrome associations, as well as international ones such as IPSWO. So I want to now take you through a researcher's journey, if you like, particularly around behavior. So what's the starting point? Well, the starting point, of course, is to ask the question, what behaviors and mental health problems occur in excess in Prader-Willi syndrome, if they do? Well, of course, there have been studies from all over the world, North America, Australia, different countries in Europe, that really have described a very similar pattern, that there are certain problems that are not exclusive, obviously, to Prader-Willi syndrome, but they occur in excess and cannot be accounted for example, by the mild intellectual impairments and so on. The one that, of course, you're all familiar with is the excess eating behavior, which is almost inevitable, well, is universal in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. However, interestingly, it does vary in severity. So there may be some people with Prader-Willi syndrome in which you lock the cupboards and you have complete control of access to food, and others in which that may not be necessary. You have the repetitive and ritualistic behaviors, sometimes referred to as obsessive-compulsive behaviors, that Elizabeth Dykins in America first described, and we and others have also reported. You have the problems that I noticed came up earlier, I think in the first session, of temper outbursts, which is such a major challenge for families and for people with Prader-Willi syndrome themselves. The skin picking has already been referred to. But we also recognize, particularly as the child with Prader-Willi syndrome gets into adolescence and into adult life, mood disorders, both depression and what's often referred to as hypomania, not quite mania, but bipolar disorder emerges. And I've referred to the psychotic illness that can occur, particularly in people with UPD. So we know about that. So what are the challenges now for research? Well, the challenges for research are to ask the question, or to answer the question, why do such problems occur in excess in people with Prader-Willi syndrome? Are the problems in some way associated with each other? And I shall be illustrating that with some work from Kate Woodcock in the audience has been involved with from the University of, then at the University of Birmingham. Do they have similar, or are there different mechanisms that underpin these problems? In other words, if the mechanisms are the same, are the interventions similar, or are the mechanisms different and require rather different treatment strategies? So fundamentally, the focus of research is moving from describing it and recognizing that it's present to identifying the underlying causes or mechanisms, and now moving to look at treatments. And I think that's very exciting, and that's what I'll sort of illustrate in a little more detail. I'm not going to spend much time on the issue of the overeating behavior, but this is taken from the Oxford Textbook of Medicine, a chapter written by Sadaf Faruqi. Sadaf and her colleagues at the University of Cambridge have described other very rare syndromes. These are usually single gene disorders in which there's a particular gene has been identified as faulty or missing in some way that is associated with extreme overeating behavior. And what she described the eating disorder in this chapter really has been as people with Prader-Willi syndrome having delayed or impaired satiety, this feedback mechanism that switches off hunger, that may be either due to the lacking of a feedback mechanism or insensitivity of this feedback mechanism. Now, I show this because I think it illustrates the change in thinking over the years about the eating disorder. So Prader himself saw Prader-Willi syndrome as being a disorder of obesity, if you like, or obesity syndrome. Whereas I think now we would see it as much more, if you like, a disorder of appetite regulation or eating behavior regulation. It shifts the emphasis away from seeing obesity to seeing it as a problem of control of eating behavior. And the importance about that then, of course, is it focuses you towards where should you be paying most attention in terms of developing therapies. Now, of course, at present, it's about preventing obesity through food security and through the exercise program that Georgina talked about. And this has been emphasized time and time again by speakers earlier today, the importance of managing the food environment and of food security. But of course, one of the things that is particularly positive about Prader-Willi syndrome is that the problem of overeating and obesity that can result from that is the problem of the Western world. Along with dementia, obesity is an area that drug companies are investing millions, billions of dollars to try and solve. So I think that if we can understand in Prader-Willi syndrome where probably in the hypothalamus the abnormality is, in which feeding, what's called the feeding pathways in the hypothalamus, where that abnormality is, there will at some point be a drug developed that may, if you like, attack or act upon that pathway. And then the challenge will be to ask the question, is it or is it not effective in people with Prader-Willi syndrome? Does it switch off appetite? Does it affect their eating behavior? Such medications that have come along in the past have looked encouraging, but sadly they've had side effects and some have had to be removed from the market. In the UK at present, there's been a resurgence of the interest in bariatric surgery for people with severe obesity. But as a general rule, this is thought not to be the right approach for people with Prader-Willi syndrome for various reasons. We've become very interested in vagus nerve stimulation, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So the point I want to make is here, what research I think has done is whilst at present it hasn't delivered the ideal of some treatment that changes the drive to eat, it has changed our perspective, and it has made very concrete the fact that there is a biological abnormality of the mechanisms that control eating behavior. And therefore, you need to take over control of that. And those are the sort of arguments you need to put to people who are responsible for developing services. Now, I now want to move to this other area of repetitive and ritualistic or obsessional behaviors and temper outbursts. And I want to do the same thing of trying to illustrate to you how research is developing and moving forward our thinking on these behaviors. So the question again that research will ask initially is, what form do they take? In this case, repetitive and ritualistic behaviors and temper outbursts in some way related to each other. Why do they occur in excess with people with Prader-Willi syndrome? And what are the best interventions? And so I want to start by it isn't the figures or things on here that is really what I want you to look at. I'm using this just to illustrate one of the problems that I think one has in the area of behavioral and psychiatric assessments. If you were researching something like diabetes, you could do blood tests that would measure things, that would give you a figure that would say, well, the blood sugar is high or whatever it is. The problem in this area is how do you characterize, how do you measure something that either is observed by other people or is something in someone's head? How do you measure how they're feeling and how do you rate these things? And this is just an example of something called the Childhood Routines Inventory. And in this study, it was used by a group from the Institute of Child Health in London, and they were interested in comparing whether the characteristics of this repetitive and ritualistic behavior in Prader-Willi syndrome were similar to those that are observed in people with autism. And the answer is the studies show that yes, they're very similar. You can see the scores on these different subtests or the subsections of this test were really very similar. So that, of course, raises the issue about whether the mechanism that results in these behaviors in people with autism on the one hand and people with Prader-Willi syndrome on the other are perhaps similar. Now, I want to take us to Kate Woodcock and Professor Chris Oliver's work that was undertaken at the University of Birmingham, and we'll be referring to some work that Kate is starting now, and she's moved to Belfast. And in a way, what I think that group did in a really very novel and interesting way was to take us from the description of the behavior into beginning to look at mechanisms. And what they were able to show is that one of the key factors here that seemed to help explain these problems is what's called set shifting or switching or attention switching. That is the ability to move your attention from one task to another. And all of you, as parents or support workers looking after people with Prader-Willi syndrome, will know that this is a serious difficulty. And what they argued it was that this particular cognitive problem of being unable to change your attention from one task to another predisposed to repetitive and ritualistic behaviors and to temper outbursts. That these behaviors then become shaped and reinforced over time. But by having that understanding, whether it proves to be right or not, of course what it does is it lends itself to then, well, what are the interventions you might do to make that, to alter that problem? So is there a place for early interventions to minimize the establishment of these behaviors? Are there particular psychological informed support strategies you could use? Can you train people with Prader-Willi syndrome in order to improve their set shifting? And they developed this model, which I just find very useful to think about. So on the far left, you've got, if you like, the genetics of Prader-Willi syndrome that in some way affect brain development, give rise to this one of a number of things, this deficit in attention switching. In the real world, of course, change happens all the time, but some unexpected change happens. That causes significant physiological arousal, attempting to manage that through repetitive questioning, but there are times in which that gets out of control, leads to the temper outbursts, which may go on for minutes or hours, that you are also familiar with. For us, this is interesting too, because it lends itself to some insights when it comes to some of the observations that we have recently made with something called vagus nerve stimulation. Now, I want to just touch on that point, the third point I think it was, that I made in one of my early slides, and that was the importance of technology. Now, what we have now are brain scanning neuroimaging techniques that allow us to look at the areas in the brain that, if you like, underpin particular tasks. And again, this is Kate and Chris Oliver's work. And what they did, given this observation about the problem of attention switching, is they had a control group of people who didn't have Prader-Willi syndrome. They had a group of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And whilst they were in a scanner, they asked them to undertake a particular task. And what you see is that the areas of the brain shown in red, it may be difficult to see at the back, are the areas of the brain that are activated when the people are doing those tasks, or that particular task. And you can see the area activated in the control group, but in the Prader-Willi group, that area of the brain was not activated. What they activated is a different area of the brain, again shown by red in the frontal areas of the brain. So the argument here is that the problem for people with Prader-Willi syndrome is they're having to recruit a different neural system to undertake the task that you and I take for granted and are able to do. Now, what we don't know is that simply a developmental issue? And I think from our own work, we would argue this may be a function of developmental delay. But we don't know that. But we know that here is some very, just like brain imaging has done the same in the eating disorder, here is some very concrete evidence that there's a fundamental biological abnormality that we need to understand. Now, I've tried to argue that research is logical and ordered. It isn't. But there is an area of research where I think serendipity plays a part. And I just thought, I did of course, what one does is go to the Oxford English Dictionary and say, to look for a definition of serendipity. But its origin, it comes from this fairy tale, The Three Princes of Serendip, where happy and chance occurrences happened that brought benefit. And I just want to now illustrate research, how serendipity is important in research. And the reason I want to do that is it takes me back to when I first engaged with the UK Prader-Willi Syndrome Association. And the first president and the person who really described Prader-Willi syndrome in the English literature was Bernard Lawrence. He was a pediatrician. And at every Prader-Willi syndrome meeting hosted by the UK Prader-Willi Syndrome Association, he would often say to parents, "Have you come across this?" And sometimes parents would say no hands would go up. And sometimes almost every hand would go up. And Bernard Lawrence argued that those sort of chance observations that parents were making, that if you found they were being made by many parents independently, were really important. They were giving us clues as to what was going on or what we should be looking at in Prader-Willi syndrome. Now, the example I want to give is the use of something called vagus nerve stimulation. And there are a number of points there where I think chance and serendipity had a place to play. First of all, vagus nerve stimulation is something where you surgically implant a stimulator under the skin and a wire that connects up to the vagus nerve in the neck. Now, the vagus nerve is one of the systems that the body uses to communicate between the gut and the brain. And if you like, effectively, the gut's way of telling the brain that food has entered the gut and is being absorbed and so on. Now, vagus nerve stimulation is approved for treatment of severe epilepsy, and it's also approved for treatment of depression. And there's a group that I work with in Cambridge, a colleague, Howard Ring, that uses vagus nerve stimulation. And the first bit of luck was I said to him one day, is there any evidence that they lose weight? Because you might imagine that overstimulating the vagus nerve might affect satiety and might reduce weight. And he said he wasn't certain, and we went to the company, and then we went to the literature, and there were examples where when people were having vagus nerve stimulation for epilepsy, particularly if they were obese beforehand, they were losing weight. So that, together with this theoretical understanding of the role of the vagus nerve, led us to make the case for getting the money and getting ethical permission to put in a vagus nerve stimulator in 3 people with Prader-Willi syndrome and to undertake research, a proof of principle study, to ask the question, did it or did it not help the eating behavior? And Karen has given me permission for this, but Karen Gregg where are you, Karen? Is sitting in the audience. Now, Karen is the mother of Simon, and Simon was one of the 3 people that took part in this study. And I really pay tribute to all 3 of them and their families, because the study, not only did they themselves have to put themselves through a general anaesthetic and surgery, but they had to traipse up to Cambridge, and in Karen's case from Belfast to Stansted. And I think coping with Simon at Stansted and the benefits that came, as I'll describe in a minute, the sort of Stansted test was probably very important, I think, in our observations. So anyhow, we got permission to do this. Now what this shows, and I've forgotten which is the button to press now, sorry about that. Can't get there. No. What this shows, this slide, is the weight chart on the 3 people, the 3 participants. And along the bottom are months, so this is over, I think, 2.5 years or more, and weight up the vertical axis, and the top row is weight in kilograms. And you can see the first participant who had the vagus nerve stimulator implanted, switched on, and what happens, it stimulates for 30 seconds, is off for 5 minutes, stimulates for 30 seconds, is off for 5 minutes, and continues all the time like that. Is she put on weight? And we actually got rather worried about this. And in fact, the father said to us, is the vagus nerve stimulating causing this weight increase? Quite the opposite to what we had predicted. And you can see the purple areas when the vagus nerve stimulator was active, and the white area, we switched it off for a while and we did various tests. And there was no suggestion that it was causing this. And what we think happened here is the particular participant, who's a wonderful person who I know very well, said to herself, now I've got this thing switched on, I don't even have to worry about eating. And of course, she ate, and she lives in a fairly food-free environment. The middle person here is Simon, and Simon's very happy for me to mention his name, as is Karen, his mother. And Simon actually did lose weight very slowly over time, and I think has continued very gently to lose weight. And the third person, really, the weight remained stable. However, I think, although weight didn't happen, what happened is that there were a number of other observations. Oh, this is just, first of all, one of the things we did is at intervals throughout the time, we brought the standard investigation. When they came up to Cambridge, we sat them in front of food, and they said, you could eat until you feel you've had enough for up to an hour. And we looked at the quantity eaten. And again, this shows the quantity eaten. And essentially, again, what this finding shows is that the quantity eaten in that hour didn't change. It was, well over 1,000 calories, sometimes much more than that, to the extent that we had to stop doing that. Again, the observation of no real change in weight, no change in the quantity eating, suggested to us that vagus nerve stimulation, contrary to our hypothesis, wasn't being helpful. However, participants 2 and 3 reported themselves, and their parents reported, marked change in everyday eating behavior. including occasions when they seem to be much more amenable to missing meals and unexpected alterations in food routine. And we argued that we think the mechanism was therefore not on satiety, but maybe something else. And participants 2 and 3 described quite independently and spontaneously to us and unexpectedly described positive effects. So this is in a sense the serendipity here, positive effects on temperament, behavior, and social functioning. The problem for us is that we hadn't collected the data beforehand because we didn't expect any changes in this other behavior. Participant 1 didn't show the same extent of changes, but she didn't have these problems prior to the use of vagus nerve stimulation. The improvements here that were described were to such an extent that both parents in both cases described them as life-changing and asked that the VNS continued beyond the end of the study. And both the participants 2 and 3, so Simon and the other participant, Jennifer, continue to have VNS to this day. In fact, Jennifer recently has got married to a young man, himself with some disabilities. But she herself would say, I don't think I could ever have done that if it wasn't for the benefits that I saw from, or I experienced from having vagus nerve stimulation. Now, we have to be very careful here. We haven't conclusively shown a benefit. What we've found is something that looks very exciting, that links back to this idea of arousal when an unexpected change happens. Because the autonomic nervous system, which the vagus nerve is part of, is the part of the nervous system that deals with response to threat. It's what we have developed and what has evolved over time that mediates any response to threat. And there's a very interesting work of someone called Porges in America that has talked about the evolutionary significance of the vagus nerve. So having made this observation, it does look to us as if there's a theoretical reason why it might improve behavior. One of the ways we've tried to look at this, given that we didn't collect data, is that Jennifer gave us permission to go into her college records, and Katie Manning, who's also here, who was the research assistant on the study at this time, went through those records and compared observations about eating behavior in the records before the VNS was implanted or started, and how the records of those behaviors since. Essentially finding, again, that the blue is before VNS and the red is with the VNS. For example, see that very tall blue one, the third block along, which is about food-seeking behavior, is that that's significantly improved when on VNS, but as are temper outbursts and things that are reduced. So, I'm just... sorry, I want to miss... So what we're left with here is an observation that was serendipitously made that suggests that vagus nerve stimulation may be helpful, although it doesn't appear to have a direct effect on satiety. We, of course, are working towards finding an answer to that. Now, what I want to do is end really just to mention 2 studies, because in a sense it illustrates, I'm taking the advantage of being up here because I want to ask you if you're interested in these studies and to see if your son or daughter would be willing to volunteer from them. But this first study is being undertaken by Katie Manning in Cambridge. And here we're interested in using advanced neuroimaging techniques. And Cambridge now has one of the best neuroimaging centres in the country, if not in the world, that will help us understand in what way the brain in people with Prader-Willi syndrome is either similar or different to the brain in typically developing people. And particularly we're interested in how that might help us explain why those with UPD have a particularly high risk for the psychotic illness. It is that sort of fundamental research that is necessary if we're then to move forward and say, are there things that can be done to prevent some of these problems? And for this study, we're interested in people with Prader-Willi syndrome between the ages of 18 and 24 who may be willing to volunteer, and we would obviously cover all costs of coming to Cambridge. And I think those of you who have children of that age may well have received information in your packs, I think. So that's one. So that's an example, if you like, of research that is trying to get at mechanism, that's trying to ask, why do we get these behaviors? Why do we get these mental health problems? Kate Woodcock, who has now moved to Belfast, is interested in taking forward the work that she and others did at the University of Birmingham about this set shifting and looking at the use of computer-based games, a training project that might help young children with Prader-Willi syndrome manage attention switching so they can better deal with, if you like, the vicissitudes of life. And she also has money to support a web-based training course for parents and carers of people with Prader-Willi syndrome to help them manage these behaviours. So again, both Kates, and I think there's a requirement to be called Kate if you're working in Prader-Willi research. As the person who worked with us before Katie Manning was Kate McAllister, and one of the participants in our vagus nerve study was Katie, to the extent that at my age I got completely confused about which Katie I was talking about. So, I mean, if you have a chance and are interested, please speak to them afterwards at coffee or at the end of the meeting. And you have details on the table, I think, of the study. I want to now, this is the second from last slide, just to take us right back to Junan's talk. And I want to do that because I want to return to this question of technology. Now, I've talked about technologies, brain imaging, as a way of getting at what's going on in the brain. But of course, the area that technology is advancing at the most astonishing rate is in the area of genetics. And Junan mentioned the whole field of epigenetics. The challenge and the big problem for psychiatric and behavioral work is that, of course, what you're interested in is what's going on in the brain. And that's a very problem, because epigenetics, genes that are switched on and off, there'll be different genes switched on and off in the brain, and even in different areas of the brain, than in the skin or wherever, or in the blood cells. So it's very difficult for us to get at what's going on at a genetic level in the brain. But there are now technologies that is helping us to do that, and I'm just going to touch on that in a moment in this final slide. So what I want to argue in this final slide is, firstly, what I've tried to say is that research is a partnership. It does mean involving people with Prader-Willi syndrome carefully and ethically and so on, but it is a partnership between yourselves and us, between families, between researchers from very different backgrounds. And I think in the UK and in Ireland and I think in America, these partnerships that exist between the association and researchers are very powerful and very important. Now, just this issue of new technologies, I've talked about the neuroscience one. The genetic technologies that are beginning to allow you to look at imprinting in brain cells are what's called stem cell technologies, where you can take a skin biopsy, it can be converted in the laboratory to stem cells which can be converted into neurons. And there's a group in America leading on that, and we in Cambridge are doing research in this area. And this work on stem cells resulted in the Nobel Prize being awarded to Gurdon in Cambridge and to someone else in Japan. But this is an example of where at last we're beginning to study brain cells in the laboratory in a way that wasn't possible before. And the third thing I've tried to argue is research, and at times it's a long journey and very painful. There's a progression from describing to characterizing to look at mechanisms to leading to new treatments. I hope I've illustrated that to you, and I hope I've encouraged you on this idea of partnership that needs to happen between ourselves and yourselves in order to advance our understanding further. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for a very informative presentation as usual. I suppose I'd just like to add from a PWSA point of view, weight behind what Tony said there is that it's only through us as parents and individuals and carers of people with PWS that we can actually progress the research that we so keenly need. So anybody who is disposed to actually get involved in those initiatives, I would ask you please to do so. And I'd like to congratulate Karen down there for her participation and the other two families who partake in quite an invasive research, which is nothing like the two that are being proposed in the latter stages of Tony's presentation there. So I'd just like to encourage you to partake in that if you can at all possible, okay?